You know, many people today, believers in fact, they're reluctant to obey the Lord. Now, I'm using the term reluctant very advisedly. I'm simply saying they're reluctant. I'm not necessarily saying they're being disobedient, just they're reluctant to be obedient. Now, there are no doubt many different reasons why people might have that reluctance to obey what they feel the Lord is telling them to do, and on a human level, there are some understandable reasons for that. But regardless of the reason, it still produces a similar result, a delay or a reluctance to obey what you may know God is telling you to do. One reason that you might be reluctant is that you might be fearful, because you know that doing what God wants you to do will bring about resistance. So it's understandable that people sometimes are apprehensive, perhaps even hesitant. So what does it take to get someone like you and I perhaps, who is reluctant to obey what they know the Lord is asking them to do, to a place where they really feel they can step out in faith? Well, I think I have the answer to that today in this text covering this part of the life of Moses. Because when the Lord told him that he wanted him to do something, well, we've seen what happened so far. We've looked at all these objections that he gave and how the Lord answered each and every one of them. We saw, in fact, at one point the Lord got a little frustrated, even angry with him in the process, because you would think after answering those 5 objections, one after the other, that Moses then would be ready and willing to go and just simply go and do what the Lord says. But guess what? At this point that we've arrived at today, he's still, as I say, I'm going to use the word reluctant. He's still hesitant to do what the Lord said. I'm not going to call him disobedience, but clearly he did not even yet immediately go off and do what the Lord asked him to do. So what I want to do today is look at this reluctance and how the Lord deals with it. So with that in mind, I'm going to read to you Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to pick up the text where we left off last time, which means I'll start reading in verse 18, which tells us this. So Moses went and returned to Jethro his father-in-law and said to him, Please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, Go and return to Egypt. All the men who sought your life are now dead. Then Moses took his wife and his sons, and he set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand, and the Lord said to Moses, When you go back to Egypt and see all these wonders before Pharaoh which I have put in your hand, but note, I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, Thus said the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Now, there's a lot more to this story going on here, which we look at it in a moment, but at this point, I'd like us to begin by just looking at this first opening section of the passage. What you need to know is at this point is that Moses has already been told to go to Pharaoh some time ago, and Moses, as I said, has objected, and in fact he's given 5 reasons, one after another, as why he should not go and not do what the God asked. And the Lord answered all of those objections. So when we pick up here in verse 18, this is the point at which the Lord has just finishing answering all of those 5 objections. And we're told at this point Moses went back to Midian. So he's still in the Sinai Peninsula in Midian, and he goes back to see his father-in-law and says, Can I go back to Egypt and see whether the people I knew there are still alive? Now at this point, remember, he's been out of Egypt for 40 years, so he doesn't really know whether his relatives are dead or alive back in Egypt. So he goes to his father-in-law, and his father-in-law says, Go in peace. So what you need to note here is that he returns and he seeks permission from his father-in-law for whom he has worked, tending the flocks. But by that action and what comes next, it seems to indicate to me that clearly he was still reluctant to leave. He still hadn't got around to going yet after all. Did you notice in the passage I just read, the Lord said to Moses, Go, return to Egypt, for all the men who were looking to kill you are now dead, and yet he still goes back to his father-in-law. And Moses now instead goes to his father-in-law, and his father-in-law simply says, yeah, go. So I really think that verse 18 and 19 imply the fact that he's still reluctant. It seems to me to indicate that he's still worrying about the fact that he killed this man back in Egypt, back in the day, and if he goes back that there might still be people there who want to execute him. So the Lord here is still dealing with his hesitation, his reluctance, by encouraging him to go and confirming that those who sought to kill him originally are now all dead. So Moses takes his wife and his family, and they return to and cross the border into Egypt. And he takes that rod and staff that God had given him, the one he will use to demonstrate his authority to Pharaoh, but off he sets. Now, remember the Lord said that when you get back there, you're going to do all these miracles before Pharaoh. So again, the Lord is continuing to encourage Moses by reminding him of what he said and what's going to occur. And he also tells him that when he speaks to Pharaoh, he's going to do miraculous works before him. But he also adds this little detail out of the blue: I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he won't let the people go. Now, for many people, this verse is a bit of a major problem in the book of Exodus, for it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And what does that mean? Does that mean Pharaoh didn't have a choice and God hardened his heart so he wouldn't choose to let the people go? And if so, why would God do that? This text has become a huge problem for some people. But we need to meet it face on, because we're going to meet this sort of thing over and over again, not only in this text of Exodus, but several times throughout the Old Testament. So this must surely be put in there, that we need to understand. It's there to teach us something about how we should respond and how we should have insight and interpret what's going on when we meet the same sort of resistance in our life. So let me address it first here now in the book of Exodus and tell you what I believe it's trying to tell us. We are actually going to be told 10 times in the book of Exodus that Pharaoh's heart was hard. But if we laid all those actual occurrences of the use of that phrase on a table and look at those references, what we would discover that Pharaoh had hardened his heart long before God was set to harden it. So this verse is a prediction of what is going to happen, what God's going to do, and what will happen during that process. He's looking at the conclusion of what's going to happen down the road. He's not particularly looking at the process. He's looking at the ultimate end result, the end result of God repeatedly offering warnings to Pharaoh to turn from his ways, and what happens as a result of Pharaoh repeatedly failing to respond to those events. It becomes evident that Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then every time he does, God steps in and says, right, I'm going to make it a little bit harder for you to see if you will now respond and turn to me. But at no point does Pharaoh do that. You see, I think this is a prediction of what God will do through the process of the 10 plagues. So when it says that God said he would harden Pharaoh's heart, it is not saying that Pharaoh would have not been unable to choose. He could have softened his attitude at any stage in the process and have released the children of Israel. But that God, by his actions and Pharaoh's failure to respond to them, made Pharaoh's heart progressively harder, as he remained firm in his contention to refuse to choose to obey the will of God. And by the way, this is not just a perspective I've invented. Paul refers to this in Romans chapter 9, verses 14 through 18. I'm going to quote them from you, but I'm going to use the Message translation this time, because it puts it in the vernacular that makes a complicated passage, I believe, very understandable. When Paul asks, are there grounds for complaining that God is unfair? Not so fast, please. By way of example, God told Moses, I'm in charge of mercy, I'm in charge of compassion. Passion does not originate in our bleeding hearts or our moral sweat, but rather in God's mercy. The same point was made when God said to Pharaoh, I picked you as a bit player in the drama of my salvation power. All we're saying is that God has the first word, initiating the action in which we play our part in free will by responding for better or for worse. Some Bible experts have also noted that if you look at the text closely, you'll see that after the first 5 miracles, the hardening is represented as wholly Pharaoh's own hardening of his own heart in response to what's occurring. It is not until after the 6th plague that it is stated that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Looked at this way, we can see that it was the pride which flowed from Pharaoh's sin and his continuing hardening of attitude that came through an ever-increasing abuse of the freedom of the will, which is innate in all people, because we all are given free will in how we respond. We always are given the possibility of acceptance or resistance to the will of God. And by resistance, it can mean our chastening by God, and it would appear to me that even in this context, a chastening even unto death. A very famous 19th century author gave an illustration that is often used these days, continued to be used these days, as referring to this in this way. I think it's very helpful. He said something along the lines of, when the sun shines, the force of its heat can be responded to in different ways. Heat can moisten and melt wax, but it can also dry clay, softening one and hardening the other. I find that really helpful. So what it's telling us here is it is entirely possible for the will of God to produce opposite responses to the very same demonstration of power. But this doesn't just apply to Pharaoh here nearly 4,000 years ago. People still today, some respond in good and others with evil to the power and presence of God in their lives. Some are softened and some are hardened. So here the power of God is seen to shine, so to speak, and the response of Pharaoh's heart was to be hardened. The nature and posture of Pharaoh's heart made it harder and harder as the light of God grew stronger and stronger, and his response was his heart just hardened and hardened. If he had a different posture of heart, a different kind of heart, his heart might have in fact melted and led him into obedience and the will of God, but that's not the path he chose. So what the Lord is saying to Moses is, look, I'm going to work miracles, but I'm telling you in advance, he's going to refuse to let you go. But also, don't worry about that. I'm going to work my miracles anyway. So put these two things together in this message, and you'll see that what the Lord is doing is he's continuing to encourage a very reluctant Moses to go and do what he will tell him to do. So when Exodus tells us that the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, it's actually predicting what will ultimately happen as the story unfolds. And God is using that and choosing to reveal that to Moses, in a sense prophetically, thereby giving Moses the insight before it happens of what's going to happen, so when he meets this resistance, he's not going to be discouraged. Pharaoh's posture of heart was tilted away from God anyway. His heart was hard before Moses even got here, and the posture of his heart was set already. But then God will progressively harden his heart by the actions he does and Pharaoh's response to them. And I hope this little explanation will serve us well as we go through the book of Exodus, because we're going to see it over and over again, this whole idea, this whole thing about the hardening of hearts. But let's continue in the main text, verse 23. So I say to you, let my son go, that he might serve me. For if you refuse to let them go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn, referring to Israel here, the people of Israel, as his firstborn child. So the Lord says to Moses, you have my favor now, Moses. Just go and tell Pharaoh, tell him what I told you to tell them. Let my people go so that they may serve me. Now the firstborn comment has a double meaning here. Israel is being pictured as a son, so he's saying Israel is my firstborn son. And of course this is referring to them as the nation who were the firstborn of all humanity, who had revealed to them how to worship the living God in spirit and in truth. But also in ancient times, the firstborn was the one who received honour. As a matter of fact, the Mosaic law comes along later and statutes that in the form of a double blessing, a double portion of the inheritance. So this is God's way of saying, look, this nation, they are my special child, and I want them to be set free so that they can honour me and worship me. And in the context of the conversation with Pharaoh, it's also saying that if you don't let my firstborn go, I'm going to kill your firstborn. And we will know and find out ultimately that that is exactly what will happen in the land of Egypt. So all of this is a prediction of exactly what's going to happen between Moses and Pharaoh and God is telling Moses here in advance before he's even got there, because he knows he's hesitating and God wants to encourage him throughout this whole process. Moses up to this point probably considered himself a failure. I kill somebody and they're going to kill me, and he probably very likely thought they're going to kill me. He probably still considered the task God had given him almost impossible, and I'm sure he wondered how he was even going to get to a point where he would be able to stand before this King Pharaoh, let alone make the demand that he was called upon to make of him. What Moses really needs is a leap of faith. And because of his reluctance to go, the Lord comes to him and reminds him of what he's already said, what he said is going to happen, to reassure him and encourage him to step out in faith and be obedient, but also through this prophetic forecast of what's going to happen, also join the dots a little bit for him to speak, to show him how the future will work out. So that to answer the question I asked at the beginning of today's podcast, how does the Lord deal with a reluctant servant? Someone who's reluctant to be obedient? And the answer is, well, initially he reassures them by what he says, which in our case today means he will reassure us by his word if we will only go and seek out that reassurance from within it. In this situation, he says, look, I've already told you this. I've already given you my prophetic word. So he's reminding him of what he said. And for us, that means that we too should go to his word and gain reassurance that he will in fact never leave us nor forsake us, no matter what he calls us to do. And that all things can indeed work together for good. You know, there are literally hundreds of all kinds of promises that God uses in his word, specifically put in there to encourage us. Okay, the closing part of the story is found in verses 24 to 26, and it tells us this. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son, and cast it at Moses' feet, and said, surely you are a husband of blood to me. So he let him go, and then said, you are a husband of blood because of this circumcision. That's a strange passage. What in the world is all that about? Now, many Bible translators think that the phrase translated that God sought to kill contains the idea that this child had some sort of physical disability to a point that his illness or his developmental deficit, as we might say today, would very likely produce death. Now that softens this passage a little bit for us, but the question still remains is why would the Lord do that? And the only way we know the answer to that is in the next verse, that it tells us that his wife Zipporah at this point circumcises her son rather angrily. Now Moses, we know because we were told he has sons plural, and apparently he circumcised the other one or the other ones at birth, but he hasn't circumcised this one. And that's the clue to what's going on here. You see, the Lord instituted circumcision way back in Genesis 19:14. So the reason that this child is perhaps ill is that the Lord has allowed this to happen because the Lord is not being obedient in obeying the idea of circumcision with one of his own children. And the Lord is rebuking him by allowing this illness, an illness that perhaps this child was born with, to take its natural course rather than intervene miraculously. So what's going on here is clearly a rebuke again of Moses' reluctance, shall I say, to be obedient. I think that throughout this passage, Moses is always seen to be reluctant in every area of his life, and almost every area that follows the prompting of God. Have you noticed, in fact, he still hasn't fully made it into Egypt. He's still dragging his feet, not only in that, but on this issue and probably others as well. I think there might also be a suggestion that he didn't do this because of the initial resistance of his wife. People who've studied this and know the background will tell you that in Midian at that time the custom was for a man to be circumcised 2 weeks before his wedding night, not as a child. Thereby, by being circumcised in that way, they became what was called a bridegroom of blood. That makes a little more sense now, doesn't it? So on two fronts we see the Lord comes and reassures him with his word, but he also rebukes him through this child's frailness and illness. And the term that the Lord then let him go in verse 26, many say that suggests that at this point he restores the child to full health. But the point is, his wife is doing it reluctantly and angrily in response to the situation. And by doing this, she actually literally throws the foreskin at him and calls him a husband of blood, a bridegroom of blood. Which very clearly suggests to me that this is a reference to the custom and that she wasn't happy that this needed to be done because of the circumstances, because he wasn't a child who was old enough to get married. And perhaps Moses didn't have this particular child circumcised because of that custom and ultimately pressure from his wife. I think that's a rather interesting turn of events, and I wouldn't be dogmatic on it, but I think that's a reasonable explanation, and the very least we can say is very clearly this wife wasn't happy. Now there's another little final twist to this part of the story. Apparently at some point Zipporah will be seen to be sent back to her father. Some who look at Exodus closely have concluded that at this point, at the sort of the periphery or the edge or just into Egypt, she's sent back to her father. We know that by tying it in with later on in chapter 18, where she is seen to greet Moses when he returns and gets back into Sinai. So apparently she isn't with him during all these times that Moses is in Egypt with his brother. Another possibility is that he sent her back because things were now probably going to get dangerous, and he sent her back to protect her and the family. Some say she wasn't happy, and some say it's all about getting her back into a safe place. But at any point we know she went home to Dad, probably at this point. But what I am sure about is the fact that in this passage, Moses is clearly still grappling with the simple issue of being obedient to God. And what we've seen so far is first the Lord reminds him of what he said in his word to reassure him, even to the point of giving a prophetic insight into how this will be interpreted and worked out in the future. And then he even rebukes him for his disobedience with an illness in the family. Now, I think in the context of this passage, what's going on here is Moses is clearly dragging his feet. He's very reluctant to actually finally get into Egypt. So it's not full out and out disobedience, it's hesitation, it's reluctance fueled by fear and lack of confidence. But there's one more twist in the tale, one final phase to the story, and it begins to be told for us in verse 27, where it says, "And the Lord said to Aaron," so now he's appearing to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness and meet Moses." So he went and met him on the mountain of God and kissed him. So Moses told Aaron all the things the Lord had said to him and the signs which he had commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel, so that would be in Egypt, and spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses, and then he did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked on their affliction and heard their cry, they bowed their heads and they worshipped. Okay, now this mountain of God, this place for the meeting, again, it's the name for Mount Sinai. And later, after they leave Egypt, they'll go back to this spot, and this will be the spot where the Lord gives the 10 Commandments, which is why it's called the Mountain of God. But what's going on here is a simple reunion before they set off into Egypt between Moses and his brother, and he hasn't seen his brother for 40 years. So the Lord brings Aaron out of the wilderness, and they greet one another with a brotherly kiss, which is nice. And Moses tells Aaron everything the Lord has told him, and certainly tells him, or perhaps even shows him, the signs that he performed. And they get together, and they go, and they head towards Egypt, and they gather all the elders, the leaders of the children of Israel there, and Aaron then speaks to them. By the way, remember that's exactly the arrangement the Lord made when Moses objected, that Moses would tell Aaron what the Lord said, and then Aaron would use his eloquent words to explain it to people. So there we have it. God says, okay, your brother's going to speak to you, and that's exactly what happens. So here we have at last a reluctant Moses and Aaron speaking for him, and apparently Moses does the miracle before the children of Israel again. And yet, there is a suggestion here that still one of Moses' concerns is that the people will still not believe him. Well, this passage actually says they did believe him. They not only believed him, they were amazed and grateful that the Lord had returned and spoken again to the nation of Israel, and they worshipped God because of it, it says. It says they bowed their heads and they thanked God that he had at last come back on the scene again. So ever reluctant Moses, he gets to see his brother again, and his brother helps him to do exactly what he was supposed to do in the first place. And that's the way God deals with this reluctant servant, this reluctant guy, Moses. So let me close by just trying to tie up the loose ends and make a rather simple observation, which is to tell us that in order to get this reluctant guy to be fully obedient, the Lord used reassurance, then a rebuke, and then prophetic encouragement, and even a reunion with his brother. So let me finish by spelling out to you what I believe and how I believe the Lord uses the same sort of things in the same sort of ways to encourage us when we lack confidence or we're fearful about situations that we feel God's calling us to go into. What does the Lord do when we're reluctant ourselves, when we know what we're meant to do, but we're reluctant to do it? And I would say the same thing he uses in this passage. He speaks to us. And how does he speak to us today? He speaks through his word. The first thing that happened is he came to Moses and he spoke to him and he reminded him of what he said and what he promises. So for us today, that means that God will use his word to do the same thing. The second thing, by the way, is he rebuked him. Now, from a New Testament point of view, we are told that God clearly sometimes allows trials to come into our life in order to teach us and ultimately to encourage us to be obedient. The ultimate purpose of trials in the life of the Christian is that we might be, as it's described in biblical language, as conformed to the image of Christ. But that means becoming like Christ by what we not only say, but by what we do also. And we can only do that by responding in obedience to the Lord. So friends, the Lord won't hesitate in allowing trials to come into your life to teach you to do what is best for you and in his will if it's necessary. And what also jumps off the page for me is the other thing that the order used in other people. In this case, it's really straightforward. For Moses, he brought his brother who came and assisted him. And by working together, the people, when they were told what Moses said they needed to be told and was so worried about whether they'd even accept it or not, that was his greatest fear. That was his main objection. Well, what did they do? They responded. They were thrilled, and in fact they worshipped God. So I submit to you that Moses was encouraged because he went alongside with someone else, and together they did what the Lord asked him to do. And in New Testament terms, in this day and age in which we live, when the Lord wants to use us and needs to encourage us to be reluctant, sometimes he uses hard times, sometimes he uses difficult trials. He'll always use his word, but he will also send other people to help us and encourage us. Which tells me we really need to be always rubbing shoulders with other fellow believers, not being a Christian in isolation, as many seem to want to do these days, and we need that so we can be encouraged by them. Now, I started out by pointing out very simply that Moses was reluctant, and I'm suggesting that possibly some of the reaction to that and his reasons for reluctance on a human level made perfect sense. They were things like fear, apprehension. But we finally see at the end of the story, using these things that the Lord did, Moses has been encouraged by the Lord to do exactly what he was told to do. And when he thinks he gets the response he does, well, you can imagine how he felt now. he will have been encouraged, won't he? I mean, he's again back in the company of his brother, a brother who he clearly has a close and affectionate relationship to you. And what I'm suggesting to you is that any reluctance, any hesitation, any discouragement, or maybe even fear can be replaced with a completely different can-do attitude when we, as believers, support one another and do things together. I submit to you that one way we can approach this passage is just simply as a study of the way God deals with a reluctant child, with one of his reluctant children, and he still will use the same methods to this day. And I also submit to you that what happened to Moses here is also what might happen to us, because by doing it, God is going to encourage us and enable us to lay aside our reluctance, and by simply therefore we are able to go and do what the Lord tells us to do, safe in the knowledge that he will always be with us.